What's up, humans? My name is David, and I help people develop self-awareness and self-compassion, and welcome to another Blue Chair Talk. What is a Blue Chair Talk? Well, it's me sitting in this chair, and for about 10 minutes, I will typically share about developing self-awareness and self-compassion. That's what I do. And then the following 20 minutes, a little guided meditation to sort of put it into action. Meditation is very good for self-awareness and self-compassion, I dare say. Hey, we are in a series here about the two hemispheres of the brain and how and why they're different, and how and why learning about them and recognizing that difference in our life as it plays out can actually help us develop self-awareness and self-compassion. So the past few episodes, we've got kind of philosophical. We talked about how the left hemisphere is all about kind of generic and categories, and on the other hand, the right hemisphere is more like new things, novelties, and the uniqueness of and individuality of and ever-changing nature of things. So that's kind of out there stuff, Today, far more grounded, a lot more practical. We are talking about wholes versus constituent parts, if you will. And probably it will not surprise you if you've watched a couple of these that the left hemisphere, the big picture hemisphere, is all about the whole, just like the overall thing. There's this fancy word, Gestalt, German, I think. And that is like an immediate overall impression, kind of like vibe, but also kind of like form of a thing. So yeah, the big picture hemisphere is all about that, whereas the other hemisphere, our left hemisphere, which controls our right hand, dominant hand for most of us, that is very interested in, much more interested in and drawn to seeing and conceiving of things in parts and identifying the constituent parts of things. So how do we know that is kind of maybe the first place that I will start. And this is just fascinating. So a lot of how we've learned what we've learned about the two hemispheres and why they're different, they come from patients who have certain diseases. And one category of that is split brain patients, where it was helpful, it was like the best procedure we had to split and separate the two hemispheres so that they can't communicate in the normal way that they are able to. The thing that connects them is called the corpus callosum, and so they would just sever that. And that's one of the main sources of the studies that we've done on hemispherical differences. But then the other one, and this is where we come to today's topic, is insights that we've gained through studying patients who have brain damage, like on only one side of their brains. So in our case, there was this huge study done where they asked patients who had damage on either the left side or the right side of their hemispheres. They asked them to draw certain things, and then they collected all the drawings and they compared the drawings of the patients who had left side brain damage and to the drawings of the patients with right side brain damage. And so overall, what they found is that the patients who had left side brain damage, which is, we currently know, the side that is interested in the parts of things, their drawings were super fragmented. They were clearly focused on, oh, sorry, I goofed this up. They had right side brain damage, which means they were relying on their left hemisphere. And that's why their drawings came out in like parts and sometimes not even complete. And they would be focused on drawing the individual parts that they wouldn't even necessarily fit together correctly, and very often the overall impression was indistinguishable. You couldn't really tell what it was. Maybe sort of imagine a human drawing, but instead the limbs are like kind of separated instead of actually cohesively together in one piece, right? There would be sort of like a hand and then this part and then your upper arm, and they would be disproportionate compared to like maybe it would be too big for the body, that kind of stuff. So this indicated that the focus was for the parts and that they had a very hard time getting a feel for the overall picture, right? The sort of vibe of the whole. By contrast, let me see if I can get it right this time. The patients who had brain damage on the left side were relying on their right hemisphere, which is the big picture hemisphere, and their drawings were also impoverished. They were not ideal, not great, let's say, but the overall form of whatever it is they were trying to draw, let's say it's like a Christmas tree or something like that, it was always clear what it was, right? The overall shape, the overall form, the vibe, the gestalt was there. And usually what was happening was it was just pretty poor in details, right? So not a lot of sort of fine, interesting points, right? The focus wasn't on individual parts of what was being represented, what was being drawn, but just instead the overall thing. So that is just one example. Of course, there are many, many other studies, right? That's not the only one, and by itself, we wouldn't necessarily be able to make such strong conclusions, but this is just another or one of many, many examples that helps us understand the differences between our hemispheres. And kind of where I think this might be applicable for us, especially in this age, sort of after the industrial revolutions and after the factories in the West, is that we really tend to, most of us, I would say, at least on average, and it seems still most or more prevalent of a mindset in the West, we have a very atomized view of things. Most things seem like things to us, you know? I almost like to think of it as a like machine parts ethos, that's how we tend to think about most things in life. And now, as I am often sort of intentionally reminding you and indeed myself, this is not to say that the left hemisphere is like an evil hemisphere. It's more a matter of balance and us gaining awareness of these propensities within ourselves so that we can then look for and be in tune with when they might be getting out of balance. Usually that looks like the left hemisphere being too controlling and sort of too prevalent. And the example that I might give us here is that it is extremely powerful. Like we know from the factories, it's extremely powerful to understand a thing based on its constituent parts. So having that knowledge is so powerful. Think of if you want to repair something, take it all apart, learn about the individual parts, and then you need to put it back together if you want it to keep working, right? If you only take it apart, you learn, you have knowledge, you gain more power, but if you leave it apart, then it is no longer the thing. Like if you're trying to fix a radio, if it's in parts, it's not a radio anymore, really. It's certainly not serving the radio function that you might want it to. And this is more poignant and more obvious when we think about doing this with living things, right? In order to learn about all the constituent parts of a living thing, it either already has to be dead or you got to kill it. That's the only way, right? Otherwise, and then there's like no putting it back together anyway, unfortunately. So yeah, when it comes to living things and ecosystems, right? The left hemisphere doesn't care about the whole, the gestalt, and the context within which a thing might exist or have evolved, right? It just treats things as isolated things, whereas the right hemisphere not only takes an overall impression of things, right? That's its sort of approach to things in general, but also understands those things to be embedded and beautifully enmeshed in their context, right? That they are there for a reason. So, this is really helpful and really important and really might be counterintuitive for a lot of us. But that is the invitation for you, my friends, this coming week, is to start thinking through things in their contexts and things as wholes instead of things made up by constituent parts. It's hard because almost everything is like made in factories and assembled from parts in our, at least, indoor environment. So, as we usually do, here let's go ahead and settle in for our meditation today, and go ahead and close your eyes. You may recall from previous episodes that the left hemisphere controls the right hand and really likes clear boundaries around things because its evolved purpose is to manipulate things. And this ties in very well with this contrast between holism and things being made up from constituent parts. One thing that we imagine to be its own separate thing with sort of clear boundaries around it is our sense of self. But whether it's our body, which seems to have clear boundary at the skin, we too are actually quite necessarily embedded in a context. If you were suddenly transported to outer space, you had no more oxygen, you would not be the same self for much longer. And similarly, the sense of self, which often feels to be sort of riding around in our head, that feels separate from the world to some extent, even surprisingly separate from our body, actually. See if you can look for that internal selfness. Where is that? clearly there's no little gnome up in your head sort of pulling levers and controlling you. And yet it feels like we're sort of riding around in our heads. And for most people, either you look for the you and the you is all you find, and so you say, well, clearly, here it is. It feels like I'm here, and that's it. I found it. Or you realize kind of immediately, nothing. There is no extra me or separate me in my head. I guess another option is you might just get lost in thought, thinking about this really weird, counterintuitive idea of a separate self that seems to be within us. If you do get distracted, that's okay. Just come back and either focus on the breath or keep looking for that unfindable ego. Alrighty, my friends. This week, remember, the invitation is to try and notice things as wholes within contexts, embedded. It's a lot easier when we're looking at nature, like a tree or something. You can maybe also try and release the tendency to thingify everything. That's hard to release your grip on, but good practice, good thing to look for. Thank you. Thank you for joining me this week. If you found this interesting, please do share this with all your buddies. And you can also subscribe and find me on the Instagrams if that's your jam as well. And I do hope you will tune in again next week. We got another one on the hemispheres coming up, and it's going to be a doozy. Most of these are. The brain is complicated. All right, I leave you with that and this. Know your mind, love your life.